Hello, welcome to part 4 of our series, the history of the Mass. I call this unit the Mass Underground, or better, the Mass of the Catacombs. Or many of you who may not be familiar with the Catacombs, you probably wonder, why would this be a developmental unit in the origin and development of the Mass? Well, it is because for the first time, the Mass, the Eucharist, was constrained by where it was taking place. They could no longer recline because they had very close space, etc. They were standing more than reclining, and all these are important to the development of the Mass because by the year 313, as you see in the timeline, at the end of this period, suddenly changes were made that were not to be undone. I have 3 pictures I found online. One is obviously some Christians carrying the body of perhaps a martyr from the Colosseum down to burial underground. The second picture here shows a scene underground. We see someone who looks like a priest presiding. And then we find someone, this is the importance of this picture, is the prayer posture. The first time in the history of the Mass, we will see that a particular posture to be used in prayer is described. And then last but not least, for those who are really unaware of the catacombs, this is not a bad example of a crypt underground, all hewn, as we'll see very shortly, underground. You see burial places on the left there, perhaps sealed up on the right, and down here. But what's important about this is that shelf above a burial place where Mass may well have been celebrated. Now, those candles and the crucifix are from much later time, but I want to show you what we say of that Mass was set on top of a burial place. There is the example. Okay? In summary, the Mass of the Catacombs, it really began during the cruel persecutions of the Emperor Decius, about 249 to 251, Valerianus, 253 to 260, and Diocletian from 284 to 305. It ended with the Edict of Milan, promulgated by the Emperor Constantine in February of 313. The place was principally at Rome, but catacombs and the practice of burying underground was found in other European cities. A good example is Paris. The end of the 2nd and the beginning of the 3rd centuries until the late 4th century is really the time we're talking about. The early 5th centuries, under the papacy of Pope Zephyrinus between 199 and 217, and of course it was also promoted by Pope St. Damasus, who reigned from 366 to 384. Of course, those in attending were believers, Catholic Christians. Little was needed for the Mass in the catacombs except the essentials for the Eucharist. The tombs provided the place for celebration. The environment was underground caves and corridors with hewn graves from ground to ceiling. So at the bottom, given the timeline, I place a few years here. I place the 3 Roman emperors and their periods of persecution, of course, the Edict of Milan, and then Pope Damasus, who really encouraged the use of the catacombs. Again, a summary before we get into the details of the catacombs is what I like to refer to as the developments during the particular era we're talking about. A very interesting development was candles. Now, there were candles at the Passover supper. There were candles at the Mass of the Apostles. But suddenly, candles become a greater necessity, and not just a devotion. It was the way of walking, the way of processing required light. The places for reading, the ambo, and the altar all required light. People in my life have asked me why we Catholics make such a use of candles. And I remind them that we were around well before electricity. If you notice where the candles are even today, they're places where reading occurred, as well as processing in, for instance. The close spaces of the catacombs inhibited reclining for Eucharist. No longer do we have any evidence of Christians reclining at the breaking of the bread. But standing became the preferred posture. Look at these images. 4 of them here are images from frescoes in the catacombs themselves. And look, notice the posture. This is the way they prayed. And then here are two ancient icons of the Blessed Virgin, and notice she's in the orans, which is the Latin word for one who is praying position. The praying position of the presbyter at the altar finds its origins in the arts of the catacombs, and so I have our people using the praying posture, the orans posture. Here is a priest in the Tridentine Mass with his back to people, but the praying posture, and of course with the altar facing the people, you see a priest in the orans position. Another small but important rite of the Catholic Mass, kissing the altar, comes from this period. And I give you, first of all, a picture of a priest given the Novus Ordo Mass, the Mass of the Vatican II, the priests and the deacons kissing the altar. What are they kissing? Well, the same thing. When priests said Mass in the catacombs, when they approached an altar like a top of a crypt, they would kissing the relics of the person buried there. And under our altars, you will find, and this is a good example of it, this would be a stone insert to an altar, sometimes from the top, sometimes from the bottom, and contained in this, you will find relics of saints. So we carry that devotion of kissing the altar over, including even the relics of saints. Also, offering Eucharist on other than a table for reclining, as in house churches, the altar was the surface of a burial tomb. Some were freestanding, table-height surfaces. This is from a catacomb. Look at these spaces, and the one that we saw on the front panel. We see the Mass moving from just a meal situation to a sacrifice. Here are some more examples of altars that began to appear at this time. Here is a fresco of the use of an altar. Here's one that is still in place in the catacombs. Here is another. These are the same altar. This is the ruins of the Basilica at Emmaus. It was a basilica from the time of the Crusades. And here is a close-up of a priest, pastor friend of ours at that particular altar. They weren't large. What is that? Maybe 30 inches by 30 inches. And yet here's another, which is more pronounced, an altar similar to the ones that used in the Tridentine Mass. Once again, here's a summary panel of what we know the Mass of the catacombs contained. Of course, there was an instruction. The synagogue service, we've seen this already, of readings from Scripture and psalm response, reading response. Kyrie eleison, the Greek, O Lord have mercy, is already in place. There were prayers that, similar to the table prayers of the Passover supper, terms like the greeting Dominus vobiscum, the Lord be with you, et cum spiritu tuo, and with your spirit. And then the ending of prayers in secula seculorum, forever and ever, and then the Hebrew ending, Amen. The beginning of breaking of the bread, the presider standing at an altar, the very terms that we know today, very dignimet used to mess, it is right and just. The Holy, Holy, Holy was a part of this Eucharist. The Sursum Corda, lift up your hearts, a gratias agamos, let us give thanks. The two parts of the Mass, the anamnesis and epiclesis that we saw in the Mass of the Apostles. The presider, just as then, took bread and wine, gave thanks, said a blessing, said what Jesus said, and broke the bread, gave the body of Jesus to fellow Christians, and distributed the precious blood to fellow Christians, and ended that part with a doxology. And then the final dismissal, a simple prayer after communion. And you see in this fresco from the catacombs precisely what it probably looked like. Here is another picture that I found on the web of the burial, and there's a lot to be seen in here. First of all, you'll see an opening. We'll talk about those very shortly. The catacombs were not entirely darkened. They had air vents and light, as we see above the rite of burial of someone. We find the bishop presider praying, the priest accompanying him. We find grievers in another body being placed. We find acolytes and deacons, and in the background we're shown the sealing up of one dead person into the catacombs. So besides the hewn out area where they would be laying, there was also marble. Notice the gentleman sealing it up with plaster. Okay. During the persecutions, the catacombs were used as places of momentary refuge. And for the celebration of the Eucharist, they were not used as secret hiding places of the early Christians. This is only fiction as taken from novels and movies. After the persecutions, especially in the time of Pope Damasus, 366 to 384, they became real shrines of the martyrs, centers of devotion and of pilgrimage for Christians from every part of the empire. Here is a gentleman standing at a very high, these are very high, but they're higher corridors than that, with the tombs for the dead. Here is an example of this tomb has been destroyed. Of course, when Vandals and barbarians conquered most of Europe, they looted the catacombs, expecting in the tombs of dead to find jewels. Well, that wasn't the case with first Christians. But you can see there was a fresco, a Eucharist fresco that was complete over this particular tomb. In those days in Rome, there existed cemeteries in the open. Cemeteries were similar to what we know today. But the Christians, for several reasons, preferred underground cemeteries. First of all, the Christians rejected the pagan custom of cremation. They preferred burial just as Christ was buried, because they felt they had to respect the bodies that one day would rise from the dead. Now, this genuine belief of the Christians created a problem of space, which exerted a great influence upon the development of the catacombs. The areas owned by the Christians above ground were very limited in extent. They had used only open-air cemeteries, since they, as a rule, did not reuse tombs. The space available for burial would have quickly been exhausted. So the catacombs came originally as a solution to the problem, and it proved to be economical, safe, and practical. In fact, it was cheaper to dig underground corridors and galleries than to buy large pieces of land in the open. As the early Christians were predominantly poor, this way of burying the dead was decisive. But there were other reasons, too, for choosing the underground digging. The Christians felt a lively community sense. They wished to be together even in the sleep of death. They wanted especially to be buried near other martyrs, saints. Furthermore, such out-of-the-way areas, especially during the persecutions, were very apt for reserved community meetings and for the free displaying of Christian symbols. Now one wonders why, if the Romans who were persecuting the Christians knew where they were, why didn't they go after them? Probably, number one, was a fear of the dead. They also had a law which forbade the burial of the dead within the city walls and the desecration of tombs. So all catacombs are located outside the city along the great consular roads, generally in the immediate suburban area of that age. You're looking at an ancient road that led into Rome. It was the Via Appia Antica, the old Appian Way. Imagine this road was built at the time of ancient Rome. They say the Romans built 2 miles of roads a day. And of course they weren't smooth riding, if you can imagine a chariot without springs riding on that. And these are the roads out of Rome during which, or at which, the Christians bought their land and built their catacombs. Take a look at this picture. This shows you, incredible our forefathers and foremothers were in building this area. Look at the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, at least 7 levels of burial. Look how high that ceiling is. It's interesting, the catacombs are excavated in what's called tuff, or in other easily removable but solid soils, so as to create what's called a negative architecture. You've built this out of solid substance. Where positive would be something if you built a building above the ground. That would be a positive architecture. For this reason, the catacombs are found especially where there are tufaceous types of soil, that is, in central, southern, and insular Italy. This soil would be very loose a very soft stone, but when the air got to it, it would harden. So the catacombs entailed the presence of ladders, because you had to get to that high level of burial spaces, that led to ambulatories, which are called galleries, as in mines. The walls of the galleries are called the loculi, are arranged. That is, the burial places of ordinary Christians that are made lengthwise. These tombs are closed with marble slabs or bricks. The loculi represent the humblest and most egalitarian burial system in order to respect the community sense that animated the early Christians. In any event, in the catacombs, more complex tombs are also found, such as the arcosolia, which entail the excavation of an arch on the tough casket, and the cubicula, which are real and proper burial chambers. We'll see those in a moment. The catacombs were the exclusive work of a specialized guild of workers called fossores, which means grave diggers. They dug gallery after gallery by the faint light of their lamps and used baskets or bags to carry the earth away, also through the lucha maria, which would be skylights opened in the vault or of a crypt or of a cubicle or along the galleries. The lucha maria were ample shafts which reached the surface. When the work of excavation was finished, they remained open as a vent for air and light, as a means of ventilation and lighting. The ancient Christians did not use the word catacomb. This is a word of Greek origin meaning near the hollow. The Romans applied it to a locality on the Appian Way, where there were caves for the removal of tough blocks. Nearby were dug the catacombs of St. Sebastian. In the 9th century, the term was extended to all cemeteries with the specific sense of underground cemetery. The burials of the early Christians were extremely poor and simple. The corpses, in imitation of Christ, were wrapped in a sheet or shroud and placed in the loculi without any kind of coffin. The loculi were closed with a slab of marble and fixed with mortar. On the tombstone, the name of the deceased was sometimes engraved, very simple, outside of marble. The tough soil and the tough stone was very easy to engrave. Sometimes they used a Christian symbol or a wish that the person might find peace in heaven. In fact, our expression RIP, Requiescat in Pace, is found in the catacombs, which means rest in peace. Oil lamps, small vases containing perfumes, would often be placed beside the tombs. This structure of the tombs, arranged in rows superimposed one upon another at different levels, gave one the idea of a vast dormitory, called cemetery, a term coming from Greek and meaning a resting place. In this way, the Christians wanted to affirm their belief in the resurrection of the bodies. On this particular crypt from the catacombs, you see I put an arrow. You can see a fresco of Christian symbols. Here's another one. This happens to be a baptismal image. There were, besides the loculi, other types of tombs down in the catacombs. In the arcosolium, the sarcophagus, the form of the cubiculum, the crypt are all types of catacombs. The arcosolium is a much larger niche with an arch above it, as you can see here and over here. The marble tomb covering was placed horizontally. They usually served as a burial chamber for entire families. The sarcophagus is a stone or marble coffin, usually adorned with sculptured reliefs or inscriptions. So it would be a clear-cut box, if you will, separate from just digging into the soil. Here's another example of a sarcophagus. The forma is a tomb dug into the floor of a crypt, of a cubiculum, or of a gallery. They were very numerous near the martyrs' tombs. So you can see precisely that they're really in a floor. It's quite large, isn't it? The cubicula, which means bedrooms, were small rooms, truly family tombs, with a capacity of several loculi. The use of a family tomb was not a privilege reserved to the rich. The cubicles and the arcosoliums were frequently decorated with frescoes portraying biblical scenes and reproducing the scenes of baptism, of Eucharist, and resurrection, symbolized in the cycle of Jonah in the 3 days in the way. You can look at this one. You can see many, many frescoes. All right, and here's another one. Of course, when you see these broken in, they were broken in by tomb robbers. The crypt is a bigger room. Look at this one. Quite, and this one too. Under Pope Damasus, many of the martyrs' tombs were converted into crypts, that is, into small underground churches embellished with paintings, mosaics, and other decorations. In our next part, we're going to find that this is the crypt of the popes. All these were popes of the era that the catacombs were being used for burial places. All right, this ends the Mass of the Catacombs, Part 4A. You can go on now to the Mass of the Catacombs, Part 4B.